Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webcast. I'm Megan Shamas, the Chief Marketing Officer at the FIDO Alliance. I'm here to talk to you in depth about your road mapping passkeys from a project perspective. So in other words, you love passkeys, you want passkeys, don't we all? But what are the real considerations and the decisions that you need to make when implementing passkeys? And we're going to talk about workforce and consumer scenarios today. To help me out with this, I have with me today Eoghan Mulligan, who leads product at Daon, who's an organization that has assisted with many of the passkey rollouts. Welcome, Eoghan.
Thank you, Megan. Lovely to be here. Hi, everybody. Nice to be able to discuss passkeys with you today.
Thank you for being here. We're going to run today's session as a discussion rather than a presentation. So I would urge you to ask questions as they come to your mind, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can and in the order that we can. But speaking of that, let me run through a few housekeeping notes to help you with your experience with us today. So welcome to On24. On your console, you have a number of widgets. So I would urge you to keep the media player open, where Eoghan and I will be chatting. We will have some slides just to sort of back up the discussion points. So the slides widget, and then of course the question widget should already be open for you. You are in listen only mode. We are recording this, so if you miss anything or you want to go back or have someone or send it to someone else to register for and watch, we'll have that available to you directly after we wrap up today. We'll also we'll be distributing the slides, which of course there won't really be many, but if you really want to be able to recap what we covered in terms of the topic areas, you can definitely have those. And then please do take the survey that's in the console at the end of the webinar, because it's really important to us at the FIDO Alliance that we are addressing the topics that you want us to, and I build out our content based on your feedback. So please do that. Okay, so Eoghan, thank you for being here. Can you help me to level set with our audience a little bit? So in our chat today, what are we going to talk about in terms of types of passkeys for implementation? Are we going to be talking about sync passkeys, device-bound passkeys, both?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Megan. I think it is prudent for us to cover both. I think in terms of setting the scene for the attendees today, when we speak about synced passkeys, we're looking at those, iPhone or Google-based passkeys that are synced to a cloud and synced and associated to a cloud account. And then in terms of device-bound passkeys, we've got, thinking about that as the digital equivalent of a physical key. So that is locked to the device and is specific to the device. And in highly regulated industries, such as the ones in which Daon's customers operate, that is the one that we see most often.
That's great, because we do research into both consumer, but especially on the workforce side, we definitely see that folks are considering a mix of both. So that is good that we're going to be talking about both.
Yes, certainly.
And then, yeah, go ahead.
I would certainly expect the considerations of what that end user audience is to have a big impact on which passkey types to be implemented. And I think blending both based on the use case and based on the end user's scenario and those types of patterns will be an important consideration for everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So as we go through these different topic areas, we'll be sure to specify nuances with consumer and workforce, because we don't want to confuse anybody on the call. So we will be as precise as we can. So Eoghan, and we could see we sort of broke these down in the slide, but if you could help me and our audience understand what are the main buckets that organizations should be looking at when they're devising their plans for passkeys, like the major decisioning areas. What are those?
Yeah, I think as we think about it and as we work with our customers and clients to implement passkeys within their ecosystem, all of the key considerations come down to life cycle elements. What we see with our customers is, life cycle management is critically important. Enrollment, migration, those are really the processes that need to be planned, implemented, and replanned when we're thinking of implementing Passkeys solution as a strong authentication factor.
Okay, so let's dig into each of these areas, I guess one by one. So can you just, when we talk about life cycle, how exactly do you define that in terms of Passkeys? I mean, we know the word life cycle means, because yes, and how to manage, credentials, but when we talk about Passkeys, how do you define life cycle management?
Yeah, so for us and for our customers during implementation and implementation design, we encounter lifecycle management as it is the real key security boundary of Passkey architecture. We need to be in a scenario where initial registration, authentication, enrollment, migration, all of those pieces fall under lifecycle management, and they are absolutely critical to ensure the security of the process. If for example, the process of assigning or revoking a passkey is insecure, then you're in a scenario where the bad actor or the fraudster doesn't need to solve a cryptography problem. They have access to the passkey. It's already been kind of made available to them, and then they can actually kind of act on that without too much difficulty. So that is why we say that life cycle, from registration, enrollment, authentication, migration, they are really what we talk about when we talk about life cycle management. So
you mentioned the onboarding. I think that there's an important point just to that organizations should have in their back of their mind when they're doing these plans is, okay, you are deploying passkeys. Passkeys are phishing resistant. Passkeys are secure, but there's other pieces of the life cycle of an account that you really need to look at and make sure those are locked down, because having passkeys isn't, the silver bullet for your entire, security posture.
Certainly, that's absolutely the case. I think passkeys, while incredibly effective and great from the user experience and security aspect, because they are non-phishable, we need to ensure that there's security policies and architecture around that supports their security and their active security. So we would say, for example, let's think about registration as part of that life cycle. How do we prove a user is who they say they are before they register a passkey? So what is the process defined by our customers or by webinar attendees for registration of a passkey? In highly regulated industries, such as the ones that our customers operate, in financial industries, tier 1 clients, they have a key concern around this when it comes to passkeys. How do they proactively say at the or before the registration of a passkey that the user is who they say they are?
We're going to talk a little bit more. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No problem. In terms of the solution here, and in terms of the considerations, we see that a complementary identity verification process with, the capture and verification of a server-side biometric is complementary to a passkey registration in terms of the security.
So we're going to talk a little. I know we were going to sort of touch on the onboarding recovery a little bit later, but I do want to touch on that because we already have some questions coming in with regard to that.
Great.
So understanding that, a strong remote IDV solution makes sense and to onboard so that you can, ultimately recover later. How do you recommend organizations kind of plan for this? And I'm specifically talking on the workforce side in terms of existing employees. Mm-hmm. I think that, there's definitely a really easy path to like once you have a solution in place with like IDV and Passkeys to onboard new employees. But how would you recommend organizations look at their existing user base and kind of plan for, getting them on onboarded, or is it a re-onboarded, or how do you address that with your customers?
Yeah, I think as we have been saying and as we have discussed, I think there's differences in implementation and enrollment strategies when it comes to B2C and when it comes to workforce. As you correctly point out, for workforce, it is a very simple process when you can do enrollment at the initial device provisioning, for example. So when a device has been provided and given, that is when the initial establishment of a passkey can be completed. That is the very simple process. But when we think about what that looks like for the existing workforce, we need to implement a similar type approach that you would see for B2C. It needs to have that same user experience and considerations, or where we are prompting the registration of a passkey after a successful login. So we've got the security element. It is low friction from that workforce employee's perspective, and it can be easily combined into the existing login scenario and login sphere that exists for that organization. One of the good things then about implementation of passkeys from the workforce scenario is that obviously the control and management is centralized, which can make tackling any exceptions or any issues far easier. But again, we do need to ensure that in the recovery process that there is a secure element to that recovery process too. So that also fits the bill of having the implementation of maybe the verification of a server-side biometric that's previously been registered, or maybe a more direct verification solution would be interaction with the help desk or with the IT team is required very directly, such as a video call or some in-person interaction where possible.
And then, so in terms of, the lifecycle management piece of, adding or removing devices or disabling devices. Now, specifically, the question I have is with regard to device-bound passkeys, like, FIDO security keys, for example. In a workforce scenario, I think, because there's a few questions that we received about this, it's a, hey, but, it's a device that can get lost, and that can be sometimes a blocker for an organization when they're trying to wrap their heads around, okay, what is that process when that device is lost? Even from the perspective of like, okay, if it's lost, I still need that employee to be able to get in, and then the other piece of either revoking or replacing that device. Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. And it's great to have that question and to understand the answer to this question in the context of the overall life cycle, because the recovery and the exceptions processes are one that we see as most critical to the successful implementation of a passkey infrastructure and a passkey rollout. In terms where the device is completely lost, it becomes important then that you have implemented a scenario where passkeys is not the silver bullet, that there are fallback options and there are step-up authentication options. So those might, there's a myriad of options available, but it is not to be prescriptive about it, but it is important that those can be available to facilitate recovery and exceptions when they do occur. And much easier to do that in a workforce scenario than it is in a customer-facing scenario. But still, it does introduce and present some process problems for our customers.
So in terms of controls, what should organizations, what should folks be looking for in terms of, okay, for example, they're going to roll out passkeys with a vendor, or they're looking at vendors, what is because this is like a control layer on top of, the technical implementation, right? So what are the kind of features that they should look for that they might not know are available to them? What is the kind of the ability to control these things?
the ability to control the passkey, like synced or device-bound passkey itself. Do you mean, Megan?
Yeah, like the controls around, like, yeah, revocation and you know, issuance and things like that.
Again, comes back to that definition of the life cycle management associated to it. I would say when we think about the associated controls, we think about the market and the ecosystem in which our customers or clients operate. So is it a regulated industry? If so, what is specified under regulation? So for example, in PSD2, we have regulation where we need to report on failed authentication attempts associated to the passkey. So, those types of planning considerations prior to implementation will make a big difference. And then when it comes to the implementation, then contextual UI and contextual user experience associated to the registration is critically important. It's made easier by the definition of what type of passkeys are acceptable, synced or device bound. And in terms of device bound passkeys, obviously mobile devices are a very suitable medium for that. Moving on then past the initial registration considerations, those authentication reporting considerations you've already taken into account. And then we look at account recovery as the next critical life cycle decision. What the supporting security architecture around recovery and exceptions is. And kind of as I have alluded to, we do see the popularity of an associated biometric to the recovery, but also there's a lot of there's a massive amount of options out there for customers to implement.
That's great, thanks. And I think just for our audience, we're going to talk a little bit more about recovery in a little bit, but so we can get to some of the specific, perhaps some of the specific like user flows that they could think about putting into place. But for now, I wanted to switch over to the enrollment topic. So enrollment is enrollment is my most important thing, right? Because you can have passkeys all day, but if no one's using them, it's not really going to get you to where you're trying to go. And I want to talk about first consumer use cases and kind of what you're seeing out there. So what you need to have happen is that your consumer users are enrolling passkeys or opting into using passkeys. We do at the FIDO Alliance do a lot of UX research with consumers, and we have design guidelines that reflect like what we have learned from those things. But things like when do you prompt to enroll? What is the cadence? What is the there's so many different ways that you could go. At what point in time are you prompting? What channels are you prompting through in addition to the sign-in screen? So what are you seeing out there with your customers in terms of on the consumer side, what is working best in order to get to scaling the enrollment?
Yeah, absolutely. Far and away the most popular pattern that we see implemented when it comes to consumer enrollment is that post login prompt. So that would be the login. At the point of successful login, the end user is prompted then to register the passkey for future authentication. That is by far and away the leading implementation pattern that we see when it comes to enrollment. I think it is friction, the low friction aspect of that is complemented by the fact that you've had the verification securely made at that point. And then in terms of the user experience, within browsers and how that is handled within the browser solution or within its presentation within the browser solution makes for a contextually relevant experience for the consumer, one that they can understand. It's handled well within that UI where they can see and understand what it is that they've been asked to do, and then the future benefits of that in terms of the progressive enrollment.
Do you think that might be based on the maturity of passkeys and that consumers maybe recognize them a little bit more? And the context behind that question is, it's definitely been there's been changes in from what I've seen in our research and what other folks that have large customer bases like you have told me where when we first rolled out Passkeys and, you know, the first couple of organizations were rolling it out to consumers, it was more like, oh, prompt them at account related tasks. So are you locked out of your account? Are you locked out of your account? Oh, hey, well, you don't want to do that. You don't want to deal with that again. How about using a passkey or other things where they're actually thinking about their account instead of, you know, the post sign in where it was like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you bothering me right now? But now we see more and more what you're saying, you know, we're several years in at this point where that post sign in prompt is actually working more and more, where more organizations are sort of going that way. Do you think that that the familiarity maybe with passkeys is lending to that rise in enrollment with the post sign-in prompt?
I believe so, and I think that's a very succinct observation, because the experience and understanding of passkeys from that consumer's perspective, from that end user's perspective, is growing exponentially. You know, I think if we look across scenarios in which consumers have been exposed to passkeys, maybe in relatively non-regulated situations, such as, you know, with say if it's with an organization within the US, which is a large retailer, right. You know, like we can look within our synced passkeys now on our devices, and I think many of us on the call will have registered passkeys for such a retailer as that. That type of adoption, that type of interaction grows the understanding hugely within the customer base and grows the understanding of the experience associated with it within the customer base. And that has a key impact on the adoption of passkeys at that post login, because there's a contextual understanding to it.
And what about from a UX perspective? I think in terms of getting folks to, so enrollment in passkeys, but migrating away from something like a password plus OTP, how do you recommend doing that without, you know, the experience for the user to be kind of different across their different, you know, apps and platforms that they're using? Like how to make it as more consistent. Now, I would say I think it's okay, but I'm biased. You know, it's good, but it is, you know, these are different applications, these are different platforms, they have different ways of speaking, they have different ways of displaying things. So is there any methods that, you know, could be used to make that experience more consistent when they're moving around different platforms or different applications?
Yeah, I think probably the best solution here, the best prescribed solution here would be like the conditional UI and credential hint associated with the actual implementation of the passkey authentication. So at that point of registration and authentication. So those, you know, that conditional UI that allows the browser to display the registered credentials, offer those to the user, that gives the context. And then obviously there's an autofill element to that as well, which is quick and easy and frictionless, and that helps them along the journey of replacing username and password, and understanding the benefits and implementation associated or experience associated to replacing username and password.
Yeah, I think the little pieces that WebAuthn offers in terms of implementation, you know, are sometimes overlooked in implementation. I think most of the implementations I deal with on a daily basis as a consumer, I think are pretty good from that respect. But if you do encounter one, it's glaringly different that, you know, isn't leveraging autofill, for example, and that can lend to problems with actually getting sign-in success, I think.
Without a doubt, yeah. The consistency of the experience across browsers, across operating systems, when, you know, when an app key or an app-based passkey does come into account, it's critical and has to be one of the most major concerns when implementing passkeys.
Yeah, I agree with that. The now on the workforce side, can we talk about enrollment on the workforce side a little bit? I think there's a little bit of a misnomer out there with some folks where if they're not, if they're not, in charge of this within their own organizations, that, oh, well, you can just sort of mandate it to the employees and that's it. And that's not actually what real life is like. So, there are, in terms of enrolling employees into Passkeys, there's definitely a need to have them be in favor of that. First of all, want to do it and want to enroll. And then there's a second piece that, as an organization, you really need those employees to be able to sign in. And so in reality, most organizations will remain with some, backup options for signing in should something prevent the user from using their passkey. So what, in your experience, in terms of, enrollment, what have you seen kind of be the best practices or what's working on the workforce side?
Yeah, for the workforce side, obviously, like in a perfect world, it would be the enrollment at the initial device provisioning is what we would, what customers want, and the easiest or the path of least resistance. But of course, that's not possible with existing employee groups. And while it is a critical consideration when planning out a passkey adoption process, starting and ensuring that there is enrollment at the initial device provisioning phase, that's kind of the number one element. Then we need to look at the context of understanding for passkeys within the employee group and within the workforce. So it is just as important as it is for the end consumer adoption to have the workforce element understand and be contextually aware of what they're being asked to do, how they're being asked to register, and how they are asked to adopt passkeys. And that is, that can be successfully done post login. The prompt can be displayed there. One of the benefits of workforce versus consumer is obviously that there's far more touch points when it comes to the workforce itself. So there's far more opportunity to prompt the enrollment and a greater, an increased opportunity to have successful enrollment leading to authentication.
That's great to hear. The FIDO Alliance, so we are, if folks aren't aware of it, we have a site called Passkeys Central where we have deployment guidance for B2C. This year, or really in this part of my conversations with Eoghan, are part of our initiative to do the same for workforce deployments. So really provide this kind of guidance that can get workforces moving towards passkeys, because to your point, there's so many touch points, but also it's sort of like users are using it at work and they're consumers too. They're going to use it more in the wild when they're doing consumer activities. So it's really important to get this kind of guidance out on the workforce side, so that it's not as it's a little bit clarified of what's possible that you can do. Moving to this is a good time for the recovery section. And yes, we're going to talk about recovery, but what we really mean is really, we're talking about like the initial onboarding more than anything, because your recovery, when it comes to passkeys or pretty much anything, recovery is really only as good as what you have to reprove this person's right to that account. And a lot of times that boils down to, how did you initially proof this person? How did you initially onboard this person? If that is a sound mechanism, then you're going to be able to more soundly be able to do recovery. And but that's the topic area that we're going to talk about. But there's several questions in here around. There's several questions around here on the consumer side and the workforce side around this. So like we probably need to kind of distinguish like what the best practices are for each. So let's start with kind of, could you like just sort of level setting on, okay, what in what scenarios do we need recovery? Or what do we mean by recovery? What scenarios would we mean recovery? And like, what are the like basic tools that companies currently have to do that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think your point is fantastic, Megan, in relation to the intrinsic link between the recovery process and the primary enrollment process. You know, if we have a scenario where the recovery process is weaker than the primary enrollment process, you then will, you know, attackers will simply bypass that enrollment and look for the recovery channel to exploit. So, you know, that's absolutely critical in terms of understanding the intrinsic link there. Now, when you say about the associated use cases for recovery, help me understand that a little bit more. Do you mean situations where the consumer or workforce operation or, you know, end user has lost their device or has an issue? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that it might be helpful to sort of clarify synced passkeys versus device-bound passkeys. Like in theory, if you're leveraging synced passkeys,
yeah,
there'll be less scenarios where you're like, there's no passkey, right?
100%. Yeah, in a scenario where you're leveraging synced passkeys, you can, you know, as a key element of the recovery process, then you can trigger a step up. Like with a synced passkey, the user is likely to have, like, say for example, they've lost one device, but they have another. So, you know, for the workforce scenario, like if an employee has lost their workforce device, their iPhone, but they still have their corporate laptop, then there's a synced passkey associated to that, and it's tied to the security key. They don't need to start from scratch. You know, you can then implement a recovery process in which step-up authentication is associated to it. And there's, you know, you can ask them to log in with that remaining trusted device and reestablish a passkey registration on the new device, say, for example.
Okay, so let's back up, because that sounds awesome. But so let's back up to like what's happening at the initial enrollment and to enable that. Like what are the things that are what are the things that are being granted to the user? Like what do you have to put in place in order to get to that kind of scenario where they should have some way, right? We're not going to like get to that point of like, I have nothing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's one of the key considerations for the use of synced passkeys. So at the enrollment of the synced passkey, you'll be in a scenario where the end user has the opportunity to not just define that passkey, but also sync that in a cloud, you know, sync that within the cloud across multiple devices and support that. So that obviously is a prerequisite to that type of recovery scenario. When that does exist, then obviously that synced passkey is going to be available within the other device or on another device, or available in the cloud infrastructure for step-up authentication. So in a scenario where recovery occurs, the user is asked to log in with the other trusted device. I think I was just going to say that I think then we need to think about the scenario where, you know, the user has lost everything. Everything has been there is no additional device which can be relied on or available or which is available to provide the syncing of the passkey. And I think that's where we must consider a re-proofing scenario. And I think what our customers see and what they implement is an identity verification or an identity authentication flow that is in some way linked to the onboarding event at the registration of the passkey. So if we think about that like an identity verification flow capturing and verifying the biometric, at that re-proofing attempt, then we can link, or we can capture another biometric and verify that it is that same user and establish that it is not a bad actor. It's not somebody trying to trick the system, but indeed we have been able to validate that the biometric is linked to that in which they enrolled with.
the reproofing is the best case scenario, but it's not for all scenarios, right? So meaning that, so there's some questions, and these are really good questions. So, and I think it, you know, really more on the B2C side, how do you, well, okay, I'm sorry, because I'm going to back up once, before I move to that, I'm going to finish with the scenario that you just talked about. So is there some binding that gets done between the user and the device and the passkey, or like, what are you recognizing, are you doing like what is the process for reproofing where you're able to, so which, like, the question is really like, is it like is it just the biometrics, or is there another piece that is bound to that account that you can look at to make sure that they're the right person?
Yes, certainly there's other contextual information that you can look at. You know what I mean? Like when we see, take the consumer use case, for example. Of course, the other contextual information is key to understand there as well. Like, is it what other information can we get from the device? What information can we garner, maybe from location, maybe from other pieces? But to look at exactly what is taking place there. So at the point of registration of the passkey, we're going to a situation where we have a high level of identity proofing. So we're performing an identity verification on that end user. And at that point, we're validating the biometric, ensuring that it is a real, live, true person, that it is not a bad actor, or it's not a video, or deep fake or adjusted presentation. And then that biometric then is stored on the server in hashed format. So it's available then when, or if or when, a recovery scenario occurs. At the point of that recovery scenario, then the end user is asked to recapture a biometric. That is verified, and then a comparison is completed between the biometric stored from their initial registration.
Thank you for that, for clarifying that. So on the consumer side, how do you recommend, on the consumer side where they're not able to onboard a user with that level of data? Because, you know, there's different consumer cases.
Yeah.
Are most of your customers in like more highly regulated industry where, you know, there's like sensitive data enough where the onboarding process is generally leverages like an actual like remote IDV process?
That is what we would, that is what we would typically see. That is what we would usually see from our customers in the industries in which they operate. Like, if we look at the consumer-based recovery options, I think really the important message is that we can't have a scenario where we're relying on potentially exploitable vectors. Like if you think if it's SMS, OTP, if it's knowledge-based authentication via questions, those are very phishable, and those are very easy to exploit. So it's really important to kind of not to rely on those scenarios and ensure that you have more hardened solutions. So when it comes to consumer, obviously the friction or the lack of an existing server-based biometric is a limiting factor. And I would say then it's more important to look at those signals, to look at those additional signals, like, you know, the IP address, the browser information that we can gather from the use of, you know, potentially a proxy, potentially any other telemetry that we can rely on. And then we need to think. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I said good timing. You finished. To move to like, what are the? You finish, and then we'll talk about the like a little bit about adding signaling into the passkey flow.
Yeah, perfect. Please go ahead. I think that's perfect time to do it.
So I think this is one of those things that comes up all the time in terms of, there's, in terms of, well, are passkeys, sufficient by themselves? Well, I think that most authentication systems, regardless of what the credential was, have been using additional contextual and risk signals, since always. That we never intended to go away with the introduction of passkeys. So I think it could be worth, if you could talk a little bit about, how to layer on, different signals onto that flow, and then also like if and when do you actually ask for step up, and what should that step up require?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think thinking about signaling, let's think about it in terms of registration, authentication, and then the actual kind of life cycle signals too. So in terms of registration, like the establishment of the synced device passkey at that point, what are the options there? What are the additional elements there? What's mandated from a regulatory perspective? What is the actual attestation that's taking place and user verification that's taking place during the enrollment? And then for authentication, obviously, in a scenario where the authenticator, it's not signing, let's look at the metadata associated with the authentication data as well. So make sure the signals incorporate in those metadata elements too, whether they be user verified, such as Face ID, fingerprint, like if it's Windows Hello, that type of element. And then in lifecycle signaling, then when we have a situation where the device communicated something to the server about what it was doing, what happens then in a revocation or a deletion scenario?
So there's one question that kind of lends into clarifying, because you mentioned like metadata and whatnot. So the question was, am I able to tell as an RP that the passkey coming in is, a device bound passkey versus a sync passkey, so that I know that authenticator, that, the device bound passkey meets my AAL3 requirements?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
I know yes, you can, but I thought you might want to explain that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. Absolutely, in a scenario where we need to define if it is a synced or device-bound passkey that's being utilized, it is possible to say which is which, and to be able to gather and process the metadata associated to the passkey to be able to define that for us. And obviously, that is situations where that might be important. It's usually a scenario where, from the regulatory standpoint, it's mandated that you are differentiating between synced and device bound.
So how do you, how can you do the, so back to the step up topic. So are there ways to do, like, understanding, okay, you're leveraging, you've got the passkey, you've got all these signals, there's some anomaly in the matrix, something seems untoward, if you will. How can you, then request a step up, and what should that step up be without it, being a huge hassle for the user?
Yeah, there's certainly an element of friction introduced at recovery and at step up, and some of that is unavoidable. When we think about the consumer, I think obviously friction is a key consideration, but from the security aspect, we need to think about implementing an identity proofing scenario. There has to be an identity verification situation that occurs where the user is proving who they are who they say they are, and that can be relied upon. So maybe that will be the establishment of their identity with their identity document and with their biometric. Another option for recovery then, in terms of the step up associated to it, would be maybe a time delayed recovery. So we do see that implemented in some scenarios by customers, in which the end user has almost like a cooling off period, or a waiting period, and the account recovery is initiated, but it's not possible to complete that at that point in time. So that might look like a 24-hour window. Obviously, that's something that's definable, and that process can be constructed based on the customer's needs.
I will say that I think that if organizations are, if you're a service provider for, like a financial institution, for example, and your customers are doing, more sensitive transactions within your infrastructure. What we see actually from our UX guidance and just from our other from our other research is that most consumers actually are okay with having friction added when they're doing something that's really sensitive, and they actually get a sense of comfort from that because it seems like obvious reasons, but I do think that, there are situations where consumers are actually surprised. Like, they do want speed, they do want, fast sign-ins across the board, but when it comes to doing like a highly sensitive transaction, or you're moving a lot of money or changing a beneficiary or whatever it may be, they're actually surprised if you don't. And so I think, ensuring that you're giving the extra security, but also it actually gives a little bit of comfort to the customer. Certainly.
And as we have discussed, and as you have said, Megan, it really brings to the fore how context is key, and how you're instructing and communicating to that end user, whether they be a consumer or whether it be workforce, the benefit of what they're being asked to do. So if it is in recovery and there's a friction associated to it, if they understand the potential security impacts of not following that method, there is better adoption there, because there is a more inherent understanding of the benefit that they're getting from that.
Okay. Let's move to operations and measurement. So KPI is my favorite three letters, obviously. So I think that in most of our conversation today was about the nitty gritty of the planning and the implementation. But of course, there's a whole thing that happens before that, where you need to get that organizational buy-in for the project. You need folks to be aligned on things. But then, of course, as you move forward through your project, there are measures of success, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. That organizations should be looking at. But we do get a lot of questions over what should those be? And I think that there's security, but what else? So is it security? I hope so. But is it security? And then what other things should organizations be tracking to see that they're making improvements in the organization?
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's definitely worth tackling that in two pieces, because the understanding within the organization, or the level of understanding that we see our stakeholders wanting to create, is really around that account takeover risk. So establishing an understanding within the organization as to what the risks of account takeover are, and how great they are from the regulatory perspective, what the reputational risk associated to those are, the obvious monetary risk associated to the customers, and that too. It's very important that that is established prior to the communication of the potential rollout of a Passkeys solution, because what we have found is that you will obviously massively influence account takeover risk. And that then, to the second part of the question, becomes the the key KPI. So what is the reduction in account takeover situations that are encountered via a passkey adoption, rollout and adoption by the organizations? That, you know, that is the, it's almost seems too simple an answer to say it, but that is the key KPI. That is the ultimate KPI, I should say, when it comes to passkeys. We do have, you know, some other associated KPIs as well when we look at passkey kind of authentication, and that's the reduction in the time to log in. So, you know, the data shows that end users, whether be they workforce or be they B2C, they have far more or a far reduced time to log in when it comes to the utilization of passkeys. So those I would say are those two top KPIs, the reduction in account takeover and obviously the time to log in for the end user. And then there's other non-direct KPIs that we see interest in from certain customers, such as the reduction in help desk tickets, the reduction in administrative work associated to password resets, or to the definition or redefinition of acceptable login scenarios.
Right. I think that those understanding that we see passkeys as, oh, this is a security project, but I think that, and it should be, of course, but what we see actually from that perspective of organizational buy-in is that you might need to be convincing your CRO, you might need to be convincing your CMO, you might need to be convincing folks that are really looking at the revenue side of things. And if you could tell that, and sometimes it becomes, just from a organizational buy-in perspective, like really valuable to have those kinds of KPIs to be tracking. Like, and we do have some we have some data around the workforce side, but on the consumer side, we have a lot of organizations that come and say, especially if they have some sort of revenue generating thing behind the sign-in, like after the sign-in, like, we are making more money because we deployed passkeys.
Exactly.
And that can be a really good way to get a project moving, because at the end of the day, like, you're improving security, but all the faster sign-ins and more successful sign-ins keep people on their way to do what they want to do. And a lot of the times that could be a transaction, or for an employee, it can be, getting their work done, which is what, you need. So I think
exactly. That's it.
Yeah. And I think it's, we're going to be providing more KPIs out, on the workforce side. Like, we're going to be providing that out to the community so that they can leverage that for getting that internal buy-in on projects, because there's a lot of demand to have that, because that's what they're being asked for.
Certainly, yeah. And I think it's really important to understand, exactly as you say, that this tends to be a security project. Implementation, adoption, design tends to be a security project, but we must not forget that ultimately everything is a user experience project as well. So that the benefits that you talk about, the reduced time to log in, the ease of use, the removal of friction, those are massively impactful and will probably have just as much of an influence on the overall success of the process and project implementation.
Absolutely. So, wow, we coming to the close of our chat today. Thank you. I mean, I think that we probably could have spent most of the time on just one of these topics, but it has been really beneficial to chat with you. I think there are some specific questions that I think you'll want to answer that. So we'll follow up with you if you had a specific question for Eoghan of what his thought is on a specific thing. And these are really great questions, and I'm sure that Eoghan has the right answers to them. So we'll be sure to give them over to Eoghan so he can follow up with all of you on these specific questions. But I guess to sort of wrap things up, Eoghan, is there Is there anything that you want to make sure that our audience comes away with today in terms of their ability to deploy passkeys?
Yeah, I think I would link back that. So first of all, thank you for the opportunity to answer those questions. Sorry I didn't get to everybody's today, but I would be delighted to respond directly to the questions following the conversation today. Secondly, I think to your question, Megan, as to what the takeaways would be, I would like everybody to leave here with an understanding that life cycle management that we spoke about at the start and the establishment of what that life cycle management looks like is really the key pillar to success for the implementation of passkeys within the organization. We need to look at those pillars of registration, authentication, enrollment, registration, authentication, migration and recovery, and the plans and processes associated to those and the models of implementation associated to those will lead to the success of passkey adoption and rollout.
Thank you so much for being with me today, Eoghan. Like I said, we'll be following up with you all if you had, specific questions. I love your questions, by the way. It sounds like we have a very captive and informed audience over what the little particulars are around their decisioning around passkeys. So that means that, we're helping, I hope. So please do take the survey and just give us your feedback on the content or any content that you hope to see from us in the future. And thank you so much, Eoghan. This has been a great conversation. I love that we can dig into like a little bit more of the, kind of the real nitty gritty of the decisioning around this, because I think that's kind of where people are from a, project planning and implementation perspective. So your experience in this realm has been really, really helpful to me. So thank you for being with me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And, exactly as you say, we do have a really keen understanding of what our stakeholder problems are and what they're solving for. So I would be delighted, to have contact from anybody who I can assist and help with passkey adoption and rollout following our discussion today.
Eoghan's email address is in the console. Don't sign him up for any like pizza deliveries or anything like that, but please feel free to contact him. But we'll be in touch with all of you, and thanks again for joining us. And I hope that we'll see you on a future FIDO Alliance webcast. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.